So welcome everyone to our WLT on the Craft of Writing program, Genre Bending Fiction. My name is Becca Oliver. I'm the Executive Director here at the Writers League of Texas, and I'm going to be your moderator for the evening during this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone who has hopped into this webinar, and also the folks who are on YouTube for our live stream. We're so glad to have you here. I am really excited for this conversation. So we are going to get to it. I'm going to introduce our two wonderful guests, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you're going to get to just sit back and enjoy. So first we have Matt Bell. Matt Bell is the author most recently of the novel Appleseed, a New York Times notable book, and the craft book Refuse to be Done, a guide to novel writing, rewriting, and revision. He's also the author of the novels Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, and several other titles. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, Tin House, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, Orion, and many other publications. A native of Michigan, he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. Welcome, Matt Bell. Thanks for being here.
Becca.
And next we have Rachel Heng. Rachel Heng is the author of the novels The Great Reclamation, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and a Best Book of 2023 so far by The New Yorker, Amazon Books, and Town & Country Magazine, and Suicide Club, which was a national bestseller in Singapore and has been translated into 10 languages. Rachel's short fiction has been published in The New Yorker, McSweeney's Quarterly, Best New Singaporean Short Stories, and elsewhere. Her nonfiction has been published in The New York Times, The Atlantic, Esquire, and elsewhere. She has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, Fine Arts Work Center, Sewanee Writers Conference, Vermont Studio Center, Hedgebrook, Kenyon Review Writers Workshop, and the National Arts Council of Singapore. Rachel received her MFA in Fiction and Playwriting from our very own UT Austin's Michener Center for Writers, and she is currently an assistant professor of English at Wesleyan University. Thank you so much for being here, Rachel. All right, so here we go. So for this conversation tonight, I mean, how two such wonderfully accomplished writers, both of you writing in so many different places and so many different forms and different genres. We're going to be focusing primarily tonight, or I am, on the two most recent novels, so The Great Reclamation and Appleseed. But I really want you to feel free to bring in your other work, and also I will ask you about sort of thinking about genre as it pertains to novels and also short stories, because you both are also writing short stories. So feel free to bring in anything you want to, and for sure to also talk to each other as we go along, because I have a feeling you both will have a lot to say. There's so much that we could touch on with this topic, and I think that when we think about blurring the lines or thwarting the expectations of genre, or writing stories that just don't fit in neat little boxes, that this is an exciting conversation for writers who are struggling with that in their own work, and who are also thinking about how they define the work that they're writing. So I want to start, though, by asking each of you to just talk a little bit about your relationship with genre, that idea of genre. And I think first as a reader, and then second as a writer. So I'm going to start with you, Matt, because you're in the top of my box. So thinking about how you think of genre, or how genre has played a part in your life as a reader, and then we can also seg into as a writer.
Yeah, thanks so much, Becca, and thanks to everybody who's here tonight. I say, like, I love all sort of genres of fiction and of storytelling in general. I always say that I'm like a genre agnostic. I sort of I read everything. I'm interested in everything. I want to write everything. I think my sincere career goal at this point is to write at least one book in every genre that I love. And, sometimes the way to do that is to put 6 of them in one book so you can go faster. So I love a lot of different things. I think a lot of genres, like a set of moves or a set of structures that, are sort of learnable. and then I like riffing on those. I like fulfilling them exactly sometimes. I think there's a lot of pleasure in like sort of writing toward a genre you like. I don't think it always has to be subverting or always has to be sort of changing in some way. That writing the kinds of stories you like is a real joy. Just to give like a quick example, like I really love heist stories, and there's an aspect of my novel Appleseed that is a heist, and like the joy of writing like the Ocean's 11 style scene where like they plan the heist and they imagine it going well and you kind of know it's going to go badly. Like it's so much fun to like make one of those after seeing them your whole life or reading them your whole life. And so I think there's a lot of joy in genre. I think sometimes, you know, people get really concerned about sort of like what the rules are. But I really think it's a set of conventions, and like the more you know them, the more you can sort of play them. And so I really think of myself as like a lover and a student of genre, and that it's a lot of fun to sort of get in there and play with my favorite parts of those tool sets.
I love the idea that you want to write something in every genre before you're done.
Yeah. It's a nice way to know you're doing something different every book, right? It's sort of like it's one of the ways to push yourself. Yeah.
For sure. What about you, Rachel? How does genre factor into your own life as a reader, and then also when you're thinking about your writing?
Yeah, I think as a reader, I didn't know that genre existed. I didn't know like genre was a thing until I started writing, actually. Because I think my experience reading growing up, I came to reading very much as like a kid in the library, and it was like you would just wander the shelves, and it was all alphabetical anyway. So you just pick random stuff off the shelves, like, oh, this looks cool, and then you read it. So I ended up reading pretty omnivorously, similar to Matt. I think like I would read stuff from like any genre, just like as long as it sounded like a good story, I would read it. And so many books, like I don't even know the titles of or the authors or what genre, you know, I just had this like, I would go to the library every weekend and I would just get like 8 books or whatever it was when I was a kid. And I had like no social life. So I'd just like be reading all week. And I just like, it's kind of almost mind-boggling to think now all of these books that I've consumed over my lifetime that I completely have no recollection of, but I just know that they were very different. Like there were like spy novels, there was like hard sci-fi, there was like, I don't know, I do remember one experience like being, I think I was like 14 and I picked up Ali Smith's book, Hotel World, which was like so strange. And then also this like Jeff Noon book, something to do with feathers. I don't know, but all these books that I chanced upon in the library. And I think that very much informed my experience as a writer, because when I started writing, I didn't study creative writing in undergrad or anything. I started writing in like as a young adult, working like a corporate job. And so I didn't know that there were these divisions. And I think I just started writing what I was interested in. And only when it came to like looking for an agent, then these things started coming up, like when I was like Googling things like that. And then agents would ask me like, oh, what genre is your book? And then I had to like educate myself on, you know, because it is I think it's more of an industry classification than a literary one, right? Like I wonder if writers 100 years ago thought in those terms, or it's like a function of like publishing as a capitalist endeavor. So I think a complicated relationship with genre in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I love it though that you both have read really widely across genres, and that is the beauty, right, of being a kid and just going into the library and just grabbing as many books as you can and not quite saying that you have to be a certain type of reader, that you only read certain books, the freedom in that. Yeah, and I think you're right. And we will touch on that later, that idea that there's thinking about genre maybe as a writer when it comes to craft, but then there's thinking about genre as a marketer, which is ideally happening more on the publishing side of things. And that's where they become very interested in figuring out, where does that book fit in the bookstore? Where does it sit on the shelf, right? So I want to start with thinking a little bit about structure and building a large story that has different genre threads in it, and how you think about pulling them in. And I want to start with you, Rachel, because I love your novel, The Great Reclamation. It's so beautiful. And I actually looked up the Goodreads genre tags for both of your books. And for The Great Reclamation, the tags were historical, coming of age, literary, and romance. What's interesting to me is that the piece of it that I really focused on when I was thinking about this genre bending topic is the I'm going to say magical realism of the story, and this really beautiful idea that it's a fishing village, right, in Singapore in the 40s and the 50s, and your main character is a boy who comes of age during the novel, but has this ability to see and find these islands that appear and disappear throughout the year, and it changes the course of this village. And then it also really factors into his sort of growing up and a reckoning towards the end of the book. And I think about how even in the novel, those islands sort of disappear and reappear, that they're there at the start and they're very important, but they kind of shift towards the background and they come back again towards the end. So this is all to say, how did you think about that structurally? Was that purposeful? When did you know those islands were going to be a part, that you were going to have this magical realism in the novel? And how did you then thread it into that story in a way that worked as beautifully as it does?
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that about the book. I love the way you described it. I think it wasn't intentional. I knew I wanted to write a book about land reclamation in Singapore. So that's like the growing of the physical landscape. So for those who don't know, Singapore is really tiny. It's like half the size of New York City, and about 30% of its landmass today was artificially created, starting from the 60s. And this project, the Great Reclamation, that my book takes its title from, was the biggest and most ambitious project that completely reshaped the eastern coastline. And I think I wanted to write about kind of this literal nation building, right? Like, how did Singapore become the country that it is today? Because it's a very new country. It's a post-colonial country. You know, it was under the British until 1963. And so it was about this like almost hubristic and like mythic act of building a country, building a nation, building an identity. And when I first started writing it, it was very sort of straight on historical, like almost like writing a history textbook. And I really struggled with it. Like I was in this like third person, like what I thought of as like history man voice, like this omniscient narrator describing, you know, with, because I felt like, oh, I'd done all the work, I need to like get it right. And I got really stuck. I think I wrote about 10,000 words in this like plodding, like, you know, kind of scene by scene, like, oh, the bombs are falling, kind of nothing wrong with that. I love reading fiction like that. But like when I was writing, I was like, man, this is not the right voice. But I felt like I had to kind of push through. And I happened to go to this Q&A at UT Austin with Amy Hempel. And I asked her during the Q&A, I said, well, what do you do if you just feel really bored by what you're writing? And she was like, you should probably stop, because if you're bored, the reader's going to be bored. And I was like, okay, thank God. Amy Hempel told me I could stop. So then I was like, all right, done. So I threw that out. And then I stopped working for it a while. And then I came back to it in a short story that I wrote in workshop. And it was a short story that ended up being a chapter in the middle of the book. And it's when this main character, Abun, the little boy that you described, who's growing up in the fishing village, he's a young adult, and these like government men come to the village, and he sees them for the first time, and they're like putting little flags in the ground, and they're like digging up the swamp. And there's a little surrealism to it, but it's reality. Like there's no magical realism, but the tone is a little surreal or a little strange, like a little off kilter. And once I wrote that short story, I was like, okay, I know the voice that I need to enter this book. And out of that, the whole first section grew. So then I was like, okay, who is this character who's seeing these people arrive in his village? What has he gone through to get to this point? So I started with him as a little boy. And then the islands that you described so beautifully came about, I think, kind of as a response to this idea of like land being unreliable, that it can be made, like human man-made, and the way in which Singapore's history feels almost sci-fi like because of how strange it is in many ways. And it was used as the backdrop for like, I don't know, the new season of Westworld or whatever, totally unironically, right? So I think there was something about that I was like, well, the history that I am going into has an element of sci-fi to it already. And I wanted to capture that magic from the very beginning. And it's a different kind of magic. It's more mysterious and more kind of unknown. And then it moves into this like man-made magic. So it almost shifts genres, I guess, from like magical realism to sci-fi, while everything being historical at the same time.
Right. And just to stick with it for a second, because I really love this book so much that the islands sort of disappear in the story. I mean, they're there in the background, but not quite there. And then the way you bring them back, it is like a gut punch, what happens at the end of the book with those islands and with Abun. And it is just so beautifully done. And you realize, as the reader, I realized, oh yeah, those islands had to be in this story, because there's a point where the story is so satisfying as a story on its own, as historical fiction, but just so beautifully done. And I was really I felt it in that moment, which I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to spoil it for anyone else. Thank you so much for that answer. And so I want to shift to you, Matt, because Appleseed, and you know how I feel about Appleseed. I read this novel a couple of years ago. We had you on another panel, and then I started rereading it again recently. And what is, I think, so genius about the way that book is structured is that you really alternate chapters, and you kind of take us from one, I'll say sort of genre, for lack of a better way of describing it, to another and to another, and then back again. And each of them is distinct, and each of them builds, together they build this forward movement and this tension in the story that is mystery and suspenseful and just so beautifully done. So I wanted to ask you about that, about how you thought about this novel, that you knew you were going to be bringing all of these types of, conventions, genres into, and how you decided to structure it in the way that you did.
Yeah, thank you. And it was, Rachel, it was really great listening to her talk about the Great Reclamation. As you were, I was lucky enough to get to teach in Singapore like 4 years in a row within the last decade. And I was just realizing as you were talking, I'm like, well, I got obsessed with the land reclamation. When I saw your novels coming out, I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to read this book. I'm so excited about it. But I worked on Appleseed while I was in Singapore as well. So I wrote some of it there, which is feels like a great city to think about the future from. As you said, it does feel new and science fictional in different ways. So yeah, anyway, very exciting to hear you talk about those things as well. I think for me, I don't always know what I'm doing when I start. I never know what I'm doing when I start. So some of the genre questions become like questions that emerge as I'm writing. For people who don't know, Appleseed is like a 1,000-year climate change novel. It begins with a storyline that's a mythological retelling of the Johnny Appleseed folktale. If Johnny Appleseed had been a half human, half animal like Faun or Satyr from Greek mythology. There's a near future late climate change part that's sort of based on people trying to stop a geoengineering plot, and then there's like a far future, like kind of hard sci-fi storyline, and they kind of interweave and come back together. And I started with that sort of mythological retelling part, so that was where I sort of began. And I had like this historical novel that was also like fantasy, right? With these sort of two things going together, and pretty quickly realized I wanted it to go through like long time. So then sort of these science fictional elements started coming in and figuring that out. I think at some point, I think I was really always tuning was like, how much magic can the book hold? How much like fabulism can the book hold? And also like how much technology can the book sort of hold without it becoming too divorced from our reality? So I think I'm always tuning that, like sort of there's so much stuff in this book. Like there's these three witches that appear. There's a retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice sort of thing through it. And the witches would come like in and out of the book. I'd be like, that's too much. It's one more magical thing too much. At one point, there was a race of Paul Bunyan giants in the book, because I also like Paul Bunyan a lot. And so I had these like the Bunyans that were like these giants that lived in, I don't know, ancient America. And I was like, okay, it's too much. It's got to like reel back a little bit so that we don't end up in like something that doesn't become our future, right? For like the sort of climate stuff to work, it had to be a little closer. So I feel like I'm always tuning some of those things. And then I mentioned like the middle section has this heist narrative. I really struggled with the middle part of the book for like a long time. I sort of knew vaguely what happened, but there was a long time with the character John who's in that was just like wandering around the West in like late climate change, feeling sad. I just didn't know what John was supposed to be doing. And then late in the second draft of the book, I realized it was a heist. Like if they were infiltrating this place to stop the geoengineering thing, and it would like it could work like a heist works when you're breaking into a casino or something. I actually backed the heist into the book. So like I went backwards, writing like, here are the steps that go into a heist narrative. And so I like re-genred that storyline of the book, like 3 years into writing it. And so, some of it's, I'm always like trying to identify what I'm doing through what I know about genre, and then also like seeing what you can get away with and seeing where you can have fun. I think one of my real guiding principles as a writer is like, am I having a good time? Is this giving me joy? Like, if I'm bored, as Rachel said, it's like time to do something else, add something else. And it's one of the things that is probably makes all my books a little messy when we talk about the marketing stuff later, but I really love that like jam-packed feel of a book. Like if I can do everything at once, then I want to. And I think that dare of like how much you can get away with feels like some of the joy of writing a big novel.
Yeah, and you're so kind to be teaching a world building class for us later this year. But what I think is so wonderful as well about, and so such a pleasure as a reader about Appleseed, is that there isn't a lot of world, the sort of time periods that precede are almost the world building part of it, yeah. But you just drop us right into whether it's the half man, half beast that we're just meant to believe, suspend our disbelief, or when we get all the way to this far future world and we're sort of hanging out with this creature that is just, diving into the depths of these ice mounds. But you don't give us a lot of world building. And I wonder if that was a conscious decision, or if you thought of the world building in a different way for this book.
No, I think, well, I would say like I'm an overwriter who cuts back. So I probably wrote all of the world building. There's like crazy info dumps in my drafts, where something is explained for like a great period of time, or in my notes. A thing that happens to me over and over is I'll write like 10 pages of exposition about something I've invented, right? Like a historical event that never happened in a world, or technology I've invented for our future story. And I write that and it's in the book and I know it's too long. And then at some point a character will just like offhandedly reference that info dump. Like they'll just be like, oh, like how the Bloom where we clone bodies works. And I'm like, great, now I can cut the info dump because the characters know it. And I feel like a lot of my world building is like inventing knowledge or memories for the characters to have. And then like I take it out of the book once they can just like talk about it. So I think one of my sort of real beliefs is that like a draft that was 600 pages that you cut down to 300 pages still feels like a 600-page book. Like you intuit that sort of bigness, or you feel that sort of thing. It makes you feel real in some ways. You can't see the whole world. And so a lot of it for me is just paring back. But I probably do write more like the kind of genre world building that people sometimes don't like. I write a lot of it. I just don't leave it in the book. Because that's often me. I mean, just think in the novel, right? So as I'm writing, I'm thinking, and I take a lot of my own thinking out before I show it to anyone.
I imagine for you, Rachel, some of that is similar about the research that you probably did for this historical moment, and kind of getting a lot of detail, but then figuring out how to not let it take over the story.
Yeah, totally. Actually, as Matt was talking, I was literally thinking that I was like, it's like world building in historical fiction, except the world is already built, and you're just finding it out through reading tons of books and talking to people and trying to like get up to speed, and then figuring out like what to do with all that knowledge. You're like, okay, now like characters need to do stuff. Like we need to have a story happen. But yeah, and it's always, I think it is definitely a big part of it is the paring back, which I did a lot of during my revision process, but also my editor and my agent made me take out a lot. Because I think it's hard to see, you've put so much work and you think like, oh, this is really crucial, or I don't know, my book's written in an omniscient third person voice. So I would have this like character jumping forward and backwards and then telling you things about like what's happening outside the individual people's worlds. But I think a lot of that felt a little disembodied and maybe like too much like an info dump, even though I didn't think it was. But when people would read it, they told me it. Yeah. So then it's kind of just like trying to balance that.
Can I add something real quially to what Rachel said? Because embodied made me think of it. Sure. I think a guide that I use to sort the stuff that Rachel's talking about is like, which I think I got from Brian Evanson, which talked like embodied perception. That like what can like a body experience in the world of the book, that's the stuff that stays, and the stuff that is like floating like that is just like information in the book often has to go. Like if it can't be filtered through a body perceiving it in the world or thinking about it in the world, then it has to go. So that's where you float away from the characters when you're in that like that space.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, I want to ask you, I was going to bring this up later, but in your acknowledgments, you mentioned that your agent told you to make the book bigger than it was when you first sent it to her. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that meant and what making it bigger turned out to be for you.
Yeah, I think it's almost exactly what Matt was saying again, with like overwriting, right? I think when I sent it out, it was already a long book. It was maybe like 120,000 words. And I was querying again, because I had left my first agent who was based in the UK and I was looking for a US agent. And all the agents who got back to me who were like, oh, I love it, but you need to cut. And they all told me like, you need to compress here, you need to compress there. And a lot of it was, it's a big cast of characters and the book follows different characters at different points in time. And most of them were trying to streamline that. Like they were like, okay, take out this character, take out that character. And that felt really kind of wrong to me because I wanted it to, it's a book about a country and a community, and I wanted it to have that like polyphonic nature and to have those different points of view. They felt, even if they didn't like advance the plot per se, like they had to be there to kind of tell the story of like everyone, not just like one character. And my agent that I ended up with was the only one who said, I think you need to first make it longer. And I was like, I love you, I'm gonna go. And so I was like, great. She's like, go write more. And I was like, oh, it's exactly what I want to hear. So I kept writing, and her point was, some of these characters, like it feels important to you, but we don't really know why they're there yet. So she kind of made me do the overwriting thing. So I think I got it to like 150,000 words or something. And then I cut it back. And the final draft ended up being like, again, I think it ended up at 120,000 in the end. So I added a whole bunch and then I took out a whole bunch. And then the stuff that stayed in, I think felt fuller and deeper because of what I knew about the characters. So it was literally, yeah, like what Matt was saying about like writing all this stuff that you know and your characters know, but that doesn't necessarily go into the book, but you can feel that, it's there.
Yeah, and both of these novels we're talking about, they are not short, but they are page turners. And I'm surprised by how quickly you do not want to put it down, but also there's so much movement in the story that you just keep going, and before you know it. I mean, I've certainly read very long novels that took me many more days than reading both of your books. And I think that's a part of this process that you're talking about, kind of knowing so deeply the story and the characters, but also being able to pare back when you need to and just bring everything forward that you want. So when I was thinking about genre, I was thinking when writers are genre bending, for lack of a better word, since that's what we're calling this event, I thought of two main reasons why they might do that. Why you might be writing historical fiction and decide to bring in, magical realism or bring in horror into your science fiction. And I thought, first, just to play, to have fun, to do something different. And then the second thought was to maybe solve a problem. Maybe there's something that has to happen that's not going to happen unless you bring something a little magical in, or you bring something different in. And so I wanted to ask you both if you would agree, if there's some other reason that you can think of, or that you have experienced as a writer, that you've decided to bring something unexpected into a story, or if that feels, basically I'm asking you to confirm that what I just said is accurate, but also inviting you to expand on it. Matt, I'm looking at you.
Oh, great. Good. I was hoping Rachel was going to take that for a little bit and I could think longer. No, I mean, I agree. Like, I think play is sort of number one, when and I think this is a really common story, especially people who are educated in creative writing in sort of my era, are all sort of raised by like 1980s minimalist professors, and I love that kind of work. But I felt like I was supposed to be writing like Raymond Carver stories, who I love, but is not me. And I wrote a lot of stuff for a long time where all the genre stuff I loved just was like kept out of the box, and they were okay. And as soon as I started letting those influences back in, like the stories just became this other thing. I was like writing with my whole being instead of like performing a version of writing I thought I was supposed to do. So some of it is just like, I love this stuff and I want to make it, and I think that's like the easiest sort of answer. I do think, sometimes introducing something that skews reality or moves reality out of like its current register defamiliarizes us. It sort of brings down our sort of barriers. I was just working with a student today who's working on a really interesting like political novel, but she's done this like speculative element of it that feels like it almost like depolarizes the subject in the book. It's just like really well done. And I think like that's one of the things that it can do. It can just lower our guard a little bit. You know, sometimes it's is direct as something like The Handmaid's Tale really is. Sometimes it's easier to read for some people about like reproductive health or feminism or women's rights in like a genre package than it is to do it in like the news or the op-ed page. And I think there's just other ways of getting to our brains and getting to our hearts. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the only thing I ever worry about with the approach, I think, is this is not really what you asked back. I'm trying to add something to the smart thing you said without just repeating it. Is maybe like 15 years ago, I saw this great panel at AWP on Truth and Consequences in Non-Realist Fiction with Brian Evanson and Laird Hunt and Kate Bernheimer and Joelle McSweeney. And Bernheimer gave this great talk about that sometimes fabulism is just like a fancy bow on like the same old like realist story or the same old like politics. And she was really kind of against that, you know, that if you just made like a magic realist version of a Raymond Carver story, you just made a Raymond Carver story that was in disguise. And I think about that a lot. Like, am I getting somewhere new with this, or am I just like dressing up something received? And I think ideally it gets me somewhere new. And if it's not doing that, maybe I abandon the approach or the project.
I think that's a great, and I need to process that a little more, but I think you're right. It's not doing it just for the sake of doing it,
right?
Or doing it because you want to recreate something, but cover it up with some sort of, some sort of costume, but it's actually having like that it's truly organic or important to the story that you're telling.
Yeah.
Rachel, what do you think about in terms of why writers might bring other genres in or might play with genre?
Yeah, I definitely agree with For Joy. And because I don't know, I think when we write, at least when I write, I'm not sitting there like thinking consciously of the strategies I'm using. And so I think in some way it just feels right. And then hopefully there is a reason for it down the road. I guess in the case of my book, I ended up working very much in this vein of like, I think there's a really good New Yorker article by Gia Tolentino about the Underground Railroad, Exit West, and Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And she's talking about like speculative realism, about how like it doesn't use speculative fiction to create an entirely new world, but to create the same world, but literalizing something about it that's complicated, right? So in the Underground Railroad, it is the railroad. In the Memory Police, it is the memory police. Exit West, it's like the doors, right? So this like kind of literal, almost like the opposite of a metaphor. Like you're not making a metaphor, you're like making something that's abstract, tangible, and like physical, and being like, okay, what if, it kind of gives you a point of focus that like concretizes all these like complicated abstract things, I think. And so I think that for me feels like the genre stuff that I'm bringing in. So it felt essential to this book. Like I was writing about this part of Singaporean history that, Singaporeans know well, and we learn about it in history textbooks and everything. But I didn't want to just talk about the facts, but rather the like feeling of strangeness about it, or like almost like the violence of it. And I couldn't do that without making something a little magical or a little bit mysterious and outside the realm of human control, to show like what that control meant, like to show the consequences of that control, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I also, first of all, do we all just want to have coffee with Gia Tolentino, because she is like the coolest writer around. But I also think that for your novel, it intersected somewhat with theme as well. Would that be accurate, that those islands became a part of that larger kind of, I don't know if theme is the right word to use here, but the idea of man versus nature, the idea of progress, the idea of all of these other things that you're really talking about in such great and interesting ways in the book. And those islands sort of became a real symbol of that in the novel as well. So I think genre, bringing in those other bits of genre, can also be about in service to maybe a larger theme for the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it is a book about control in a way, like human control over landscape. So the islands were an element that were outside of human control, I guess. Like not even a symbol, but just like literally they existed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's making me think a little bit, when Rachel's talking about her islands and talking about speculative realism. I think one of the reasons I've always been drawn to these different kinds of like non-realist sort of genres is I was raised like very religiously by people who are like kind of like Bible literalists, right? So like if my mom talks about like angels, she means like literal beings that exist in the world. And when you stop believing in that, it's still like the realism of my youth is a realism that incorporates things that I would now consider non-realist, right? So to write something that has these sort of mystical or magical or fabulous sort of elements is weirdly like writing into like the world I was raised in a way that is really interesting to me. And I used to feel really strong. I think that's tapped down a little bit, but like when I was writing my first novel, writing a like mythological, like kind of non-realist family novel, felt like I was actually just kind of writing like two doors over version of the kind of realism I was raised in. So like my reality register shifted when I didn't believe those things anymore, but my attraction to that kind of reality register did not, you know. And so sometimes it is in making these things that they feel emotionally true or they feel speculatively real, even though they are not like empirically real in our reality.
Yeah. What about the difference between thinking about genre and even blending genre in longer form in novels versus short fiction? And do either of you really, Matt, I believe you do, right? You do some genre bending and blending in your short fiction. Rachel, I don't know if you do or not. I read a few of your pieces and it didn't immediately strike me that there were other genre threads coming in, but I'm curious to know, is that something you think about for your short fiction? So I'm going to start with you, Rachel.
Yeah, I have written some that are most of my published short fiction is realist. And I have written some that is less realist, but it doesn't get published. Maybe I'm like sending it to the wrong places. I don't know. But I think, yeah, I mean, I love reading short stories that have that element of like, departure from like, I love that term that Matt used, the reality register, because who's to say what's real and what's not real, right? It's like you are living it. It's like, when we write fiction, we're saying this is what the world feels like to me. And so the speculative stuff is as true as the non-speculative stuff. But like one of the books that I teach often is Diane Cook's Man v Nature.
Yeah.
I love, it's amazing. And I feel like people haven't read, I highly recommend everyone read it. I feel like it wasn't.
Tell us about it. Tell us what you love about it.
Incredible. Well, it's like, it's genre, like all the stories are, I don't know, like they're sci-fi kind of, but not really, because you are in an alternate world in every story, but she doesn't tell you anything about the worlds. Like they're very spare stories, and there's a really strong atmosphere in each story. Like I remember there's one story, it's called It's Coming. And it's like, do you remember? It's like these office workers, and they're very funny. Maybe like George Saunders vibes, but like very different voice, a little more like ominous and maybe darker. So this story, It's Coming, it's like these office workers who are in a building, and you just hear this refrain that goes on through a story. It's just like, it's coming, and you never know what it is. And the office workers are just like freaking out, but it's almost funny. It's like they've like, all the CEOs have their like parachutes that like their secretaries have stolen. And then there are these people who are like hooking up in the like cubicles, like, you know, in their like last like bid for, you know, it's just like, it's kind of absurd and dark, but also like definitely borrows heavily from like science fictional genres or fantasy even, but it's very, I guess, literary. It's published in a very literary way as well. So all this to say, like I hugely admire it and I love it and I teach it and read it, but I haven't successfully written that much of it.
We believe in you. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages of the short story is really just what you were talking about in Man v Nature by Diane Cook for Jeffrey. You can move so fast in a short story that the reader doesn't ask a lot of questions. Where I think like the weird stuff in a novel, like eventually the reader tends to be like, how does this work? Why does this work? Even if you don't want them to ask those questions, you have to kind of block them somehow. Where I think in the short story, you can just go really quickly. The title story of my collection, A Tree or a Person or a Wall, is like a weird horror story about child abduction, where a man brings this boy to a room where there's like an albino ape that like watches this boy while the man is not there. I don't even really know how that works. I don't know where this ape come from. I don't know how it's like an emotionally true kind of story again, right? Like it's a weird story. But it's like, I'm not totally worried about like the provenance of the ape or anything like that. And I don't think a reader is either. Like you can just get in and out with like kind of weirdness in a different speed, where like the novel version of that would have like chapters about the ape's childhood or something. Like there, you do all this other stuff to make it feel real. So I think that's part of the advantage. I also say like, you just can play at the short story level because it's just a smaller investment, even though it takes me forever to write a short story. The last short story I wrote, I was like, that could have been 3 months of novel writing. Like, it's just so much work. But I do think you can like try things really quickly. And so you can try other genres, you can try other things. You can, I don't know if we're talking about this genre too, but like I love rom-coms. I love thinking about rom-coms. I love the moves of rom-coms. I don't know that in the short term I'm going to write like a romantic comedy novel or something. But you can play with the meet cute in a short story, right? You can do those kind of like core moves at a different scale, and I think that's really attractive.
I think you did promise at the start of this that you were going to write a rom-com at some point, that you
Gotta
were going
do
to
it.
write
It's
everything that there is to write, Matt. We heard. So to circle back to something we touched on earlier, when we think about genre as writers, maybe we're thinking about it more on the craft side, on this in service to a story. What are the different elements of craft and perhaps genre elements that we want to bring in? But when you talk about genre in the larger publishing world, it really is about being able to talk about a book in a way that people will understand, and that will tell them pretty quickly where it fits on the shelf, who the audience is, all of these other things. And so it can be challenging when you're bending genres because you come up against folks who want you to put it into an understandable box. So I want to ask each of you about that. And Matt, I'm going to start with you too, because you also wrote, I want to say Appleseed published just around the time that we all started hearing cli-fi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate fiction. So in some ways, a new genre that was born, but one that has all of these other elements. So what was that like, the process for this book in terms of talking about it, and also how your publisher talked about it in order to make it understandable to the larger world?
Yeah, I would say like for me, and maybe this is again my like genre agnosticism, like I just don't care that much, like as a person. So when I was talking to editors who were interested in buying the book, I talked to one editor who was like, this isn't like your literary fiction at all. This is like a pure science fiction novel that's so exciting. And I was like, great. And then I talked to another editor and they were like, this isn't science fiction. This is like literary speculative fiction. I was like, great. Like let's print some books. Like I don't care that much, and I think in the end it worked out really well. I think it was sort of published on like a literary imprint at HarperCollins, but then promoted in science fiction ways in a lot of ways, and won some science fiction, or was longest for science fiction awards on some science fiction lists and stuff, and got reviewed in those venues. I felt really lucky to sort of get to inhabit both those spaces. I do think you should know the conversation in the genres that you're in or adjacent to. Like pretend like you do have to understand what's happening in publishing, like to some extent, or have an agent who will totally take that off your plate for you, which would also be fine. I have a really good agent who does a good job sort of positioning me, I think, and so that's helpful. But I don't know. I don't feel super invested in that part of the question, except that I guess the thing I try to avoid is, especially if you've come from like a literary fiction background, and I'm an MFA and I'm teaching an MFA program, and my books have always really been published as literary fiction, at least in the US. I think you can be snobbish sometimes toward genres, which you see writers do. Like Ian McEwan like talked about inventing like a science fiction genre when his last book came out, and like he didn't, and also don't do that. And like just be cool. Like it's anyone who likes your book is a great person, obviously. And you should be sort of open to that. And I'll say I think the kind of work I do, and maybe my identity as a person, is that I rarely get like shunted into a place that people feel like is diminishing the work in some way. That these sort of genre questions have really for me been opportunities. How many doors can we keep open for the book? And I know sometimes for people writing and like things that get called like commercial women's fiction or something, you feel like you're getting shunted and trying to stay out of a genre becomes like a thing that maybe you're trying to do. But for me and my work, I haven't had to do that. So I'm always just trying to like, anyone who's interested, let's make that case, and let's pay my debts. Like this book was hugely influenced by like Ursula Guin and Ian Banks and people like that. It is a science fiction novel to me, and so there's no reason to like pretend it's not out of some kind of snobbishness either.
Right. It does seem like the MFA world as well is opening up more to students who are coming to workshops, whereas there was a time, I think, where genre projects weren't really widely accepted, or writers who were writing in genre, and it's changed a little bit as well, right?
Yeah, and I think it's changed a lot. Like it's totally different than, I mean, I got my MFA 13 years ago, and it's pretty different from then already. Although I think people were open then, but my MFA students are like at least half like genre writers at this point of some kind, on the ways we're talking about today.
Yeah. Rachel, what about you in that publishing side of it? And not only just for the Great Reclamation, but for Suicide Club too. I'm wondering what the genre conversations were like for you as you were publishing these books.
So I think for the Great Reclamation, it was pretty straightforward. It was literary fiction because like the prose style, like the subject matter, it just was, it was going to be literary fiction, even though it had elements of genre in it. This definitely came a lot more with my first book, Suicide Club, and that I had the same experience as Matt, where I was speaking to publishers across like totally wide range of like I spoke to Tor, and then I spoke to like Henry Holt, who ended up being my publisher at Macmillan, and then I think I spoke to like even an imprint that did primarily romance. It was just like it was kind of like a wide spread, and it was an exhilarating experience, because I was like, oh wow, like people are reading it in such vastly different ways, and that's really cool, and it like can bring so many different audiences to it. I do think that it made it difficult in a way. I did feel like it was a little bit more difficult for that book to find its audience versus The Great Reclamation, which was maybe like a little more straightforward, because I think, it was hard to, you kind of have to straddle how you talk about the book. So you try to bring both sides to it, but then neither reader is fully satisfied. Mm-hmm. Like I know I got a lot of reviews where like sci-fi people were like, wow, I thought this was going to be like about this world and blah, blah. And then it doesn't really go into the world. It's just about the characters and their feelings, and their relationships. And it's kind of slow and there's no plot. And then on the literary side, it's sort of like, oh, I thought, there would be like more to the characters. And like, I don't know, the writing was like a little, like too fast paced, so it kind of did, right. It sort of did face some challenges in that way, but then there were people who loved it and like responded to it as I had hoped they would. So I don't know, I think all of it is out of our hands as writers in any case. Like definitely try to be aware of it, but also ideally don't let it affect the work itself. Like you're just going to write what you are going to write and what you feel passionate about, and then trust that it will find an audience, because that's all you can do. And then if it doesn't, like that's very sad, it's very hard, but then you write the next thing.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, having an industry, a partner like an agent who's able to help you navigate, this is what it looks like if your book is published by Tor. This is the way that they will market it. This is what the cover might, end up being. And this is what it looks like with Henry Holt. And one is not better than the other, but it is a different publishing experience, and just having an idea of both of those things, I think. And this goes to one of the questions that popped into the Q&A box, which we've sort of been touching on here, but if you had any additional thoughts about that idea, that sort of genre versus literary debate, can genre work be literary? I would say yes, I would think it is, but if either of you have anything that you want to expand on in terms of that, please do.
You know, when I wrote, so when I was out on submission with Suicide Club, I actually faced a lot more resistance from the genre side. Like it was more accepted in the literary world. And I think, yeah, because there were genre elements, but it wasn't plot driven enough, or it didn't have enough of like all the other things that people expect. Like as we were talking about conventions earlier, like certain world building conventions, or, so I feel like the question goes both ways, right? It's like, it's not just can genre work be literary, but can literary work be genre? And each field has its own conventions.
Yeah, for sure. And absolutely. And there are certain conventions that if you're going to be published by a publisher that truly is in that genre space, they're going to expect that you are going to meet some certain bars that are set for that work. Matt, what about you in this literary genre debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Rachel said seems right too. And yeah, the sort of questions go both ways in those publishing spaces. A weird thing for people in the audience who might be writing in that speculative sci-fi bubble where your book could really go either way. I'm obsessed with this thing that I've sort of noticed helping students on like agent websites where agents will say they're interested in like speculative work, and in parentheses it will say like on Earth. And like there's this like, if the work takes place on Earth, even if it's in the far future, even if it's really weird, then it can be speculative. And if it's on another planet, it's science fiction. No matter how good your characters are, no matter how beautiful your language is, no matter how whatever your markers of literary fiction are, there's this like, I've never heard a writer define speculative fiction as that way. But it seems that agents, perhaps, and maybe Becca can give me insight to this, define speculative fiction as on Earth. So I think so that's maybe part of it that I think is really interesting and might tell you how to query a little bit. I don't know that would happen with I don't think it can't be sci-fi if it's on Earth, right? I think it's like the other way. This is like a square rectangle question. And then I'm a little obsessed with Rebecca Mackay's new book. I have some questions for you, which I really loved. I think it's a fantastic novel. And it's like a podcaster crime novel, right? So it's like mimicking like true crime podcast kind of conventions. And it's like 450 pages long, right? It reads really fast. It's a page turner. It's a good book. But as I was reading it, I could feel the like pure crime novel version of the book inside the literary crime novel book I was reading. Like there's a version of that book that's 280 pages long, and all that's taken out is like all of the interiority. Like, like, which is not to say crime novels don't have interiority, but in like a pure genre space, where you're like writing a series of detective novels or something, it's very rare to spend like the kind of interiority like Rebecca Mackay is capable of. And I wouldn't say one book would be better than the other. They're just different. But I've been thinking a lot about that book. There's like an interesting erasure to do where you make Rebecca's book into something else that I'm sort of curious about. So sometimes there are these like genre things that make it feel that way. Like Rachel was talking about why hers wasn't a book for Tor. It's probably related to some of these same things, which is not to say like Tor books don't have great characterization or interiority. It's just like maybe the markers people are looking for. And it does change the pace of the book to have that stuff in it.
Like, I wonder if Rebecca Mackay's book was marketed as a crime novel. People would get really upset, probably. They would be like, this is so long, or like, there is no suspense. Or I don't know. It's like,
My second novel was a detective novel that's like an anti-detective novel that, because Soho Press, who published it, also does a lot of crime. I did a lot of events with crime people, and a bookstore owner of like one of the most famous crime novel bookstores in the country like did an event with me, and she was like, I love books that have plots. Your book doesn't have a plot. Tell us why. And I was like, oh, this is such a wonderful discussion we're about to have. I'm like, well, it does have a plot. It just have, but
you just have to work a little harder to find it.
Yeah, or it works a different way, certainly a different pace. It really does. And some of the things that I did in that book, which were subverting the genre, irritated genre readers. That was like, there were things where I was like, there may be some things that, this is too long of a discussion, but things I think of as like maybe moral failings of the average procedural. And so I did things against those, and people were like, why didn't this work the way procedurals work? And so I was not giving genre markers. I'm sure, Rach, you get that with history. Yours is a because it's a literary historical novel. Pure historical novels would not have islands that appear and disappear and like things like that. And someone who just wants to learn about Singapore's history in a novel will be frustrated by those islands.
Like I said, thankfully that hasn't come up with this book.
Good. Oh no, then no
so
one has.
So far, I don't know. I'm also steering much clearer of Goodreads than with my first.
Absolutely, never
I
look
was
at
like
Goodreads.
totally terribly masochistic about it. But I do think, if you are writing between genres, you do kind of have to expect that you're not going to please everyone. Like there are going to be people on one side who say, like, I have another friend who wrote a book that starts with a murder, but it's a very literary book about the characters who are kind of around the murder. But then when it's revealed what happened, it's not a murder, it's a death. And then when it's revealed like what happened with the death, it's sort of an anticlimactic moment. And I know it was sold as a crime novel, and then readers were really upset about it. Like she would get like emails about it. And so I think you just have to be aware that that's a possible response, because different readers have different expectations, right? And then if it's marketed to both, then you're going to get on one side, people will say, oh, it's not fast enough, and on the other side they'll be like, oh, there's not enough interiority, and you're like, well, it can't be both, because these people all have different expectations.
Absolutely.
And I think there was a question in the Q&A about like how to query if you have that kind of book. I think your best bet, as with all queries, is to find books that are similar, right? Like books that are inspirations or models, and then see who represents those people, because those are the ones who are going to get it. Because even if you query other agents and you say what the genre is, it means different things for so many different people, right? So the best bet is like actually finding books that are, feel comparable in like tone, voice, style, everything.
Yeah, that's my answer too. And even when you go to get blurbs and stuff, it's like you're trying to like get a seat at the table you want to be at, right? It's like you're trying to position your book in that way. I think the comps actually do a lot of that work. Rebecca had started this by asking about Cli-Fi. Like my marketing person at HarperCollins, she was fantastic, had never heard of Cli-Fi, said in a meeting, and she was like, oh, that's interesting, what's that word? And I, of course, I've been hearing that for 10 years as like a writer, right? And there's always things like that. Like you can't, like writers and academics and booksellers and agents and editors all talk about books in completely different ways. And one of the reasons to come to panels like this is to keep adding all those different ways, so you know how to like code switch about your work as you move through the world.
Well, and I want to ask one more question and then go into some of these additional questions before we close out tonight. But it does seem to take it seems to require a bit of confidence or daring, or just I'm wondering how you each found that ability to give yourselves permission to cross these lines or do something a little bit different in your work. And if it came naturally for you, or if it is developed over time for yourself as a writer. Have you always been open to not necessarily following the rules, but writing the stories that you want to write and bringing in what they need? Or has it been something that you've learned, or did you have to unlearn another way of doing it? So just to say, for the folks in the room, especially who came here tonight because they have heard or have thought themselves, I'm writing something that maybe isn't so easy to define, but it feels like the right story to write. How did you both find that confidence to do that as writers yourselves? Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
I think in a way, ignorance is bliss, because when I started writing my first book, I didn't know any writers in real life. I was like working in a totally different field, and I was just trying to write something that I like to read. I guess I was like writing in the zone of like what I like to read, like the kinds of books I liked to read. And so I didn't feel like I was bending any rules. Like I didn't know what the rules were. And then I think when I went to my MFA, because I actually went to my MFA after my first book was sold, and then I wrote The Great Reclamation during my MFA, I did start feeling the like pressure, the constraints a little bit more. Not that anyone was putting that on me, but just being aware of like what everyone else is writing and like how it's perceived by like, journals and agents and all this stuff. And so I think that's like sort of what I mentioned earlier with, writing the first draft or a bit of the first draft of The Great Reclamation in this like serious historical voice, right? It was kind of like, I'm writing historical fiction. I need to get the facts right, and all of this stuff. And I think, again, it's always coming back to that question of are you excited by what you're working on? You know, if it feels dutiful and like you're doing it like as a homework assignment, you know, because you think it's like the right way to do it and you're sort of plodding on, then why do it? It's like you know, no one is asking this of you. Like you only write because you presumably love it and it brings you joy and it's, you know, something that you want to do. So yeah, I think I needed to hear that from an external source. In my case, it was like Amy Hempel was the Deus Ex Machina who like said, you know, if you're bored, you should just stop. So that I could find the voice that I was actually interested in. But yeah, so I think always come back to that question of like joy and like why do it?
I love that. If you're going to hear it from someone, Amy Hempel is a pretty good person to hear it from.
Yeah.
Matt, what about you? Did you always had permission to do this? Or find it
Yeah,
along the
somewhat.
way?
I mean, I think I like what I like, and I can't do a lot of other things. It's hard for me to it would be hard for me to be a different kind of writer. You know, as Rachel was saying, like if you're not enjoying what you're doing or you're doing it for the wrong reasons, like you should stop. I think I always think of like obligatory writing or obligatory reading. I feel like I'm supposed to be reading these kind of books. Like that's just like a death sentence enjoying books, right? You should just read what you want. Melissa Febos talks about like writing like for the writer of the best faith. And I think about that a lot, like write it for the reader you actually want to read your books, even if you've made that person up, rather than like these people who would dislike what you're doing. Like don't imagine people who would dislike your books. There's enough people who dislike your books. You don't have to make them up. You just like go forward. And so I think that's really important to me. I don't know. I think I don't want to say like I don't have any doubts about it. Like in the third year of writing your Johnny Appleseed fan fiction novel, you're like, is this a good idea? But when I was done with it, I knew I'd written the book I'd wanted to write, and I'd done the work, and it was good. And when I sent it to Kirby, my agent, I sent it to him, and I was like, if Kirby doesn't like it, I'll just get another agent. Like I just, you know, and I love Kirby. I've worked with him like 10 years, but I'm like, if he doesn't like, it's a good book. I know it's a good book. And I want to write toward that. I want my sense of what I should be doing to be the sense, you know. And you know, it doesn't, I by no means saying I believe that every day of everything I'm doing. Like I have lots of crises, but when I'm done, I did what I wanted to do. And I think that's the thing I'm always aiming for. Like I'm writing my books for my reasons, and hopefully there's a space for them in the world. And if there's not, I still did the thing I wanted to do. And I think that matters a lot to me too. That we talk about publishing these things, of course, but like the best stuff happens at the desk, you know. And like I had all those days of having fun writing that stuff and making things up and figuring out the problems and like putting in everything I love into a book. Maybe that's the last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, is like I think one way to write a novel is to fill the novel with like everything you like. And that's one of the ways you end up with like a genre bent novel, because you like a lot of things. And I often feel that at the end, like this is a container of stuff I liked during the time I was writing this book. And that feels like as good a reason for it to exist for me as any other.
I love it. So we're going to rapid fire a few questions at you, and then we're going to let you go on with your lives. But here we go. What genre authors and literary authors influenced your writing the most? So both of you, give us a couple people who've influenced you that maybe will be takeaways for the folks here.
Yeah, I can do a couple real quick.
Matt.
Nope, Rachel. No, Matt's in now. I'll go real quick so Rachel can think. Brian Evanson's work was really important to me, who's definitely a person in like literary horror, literary sci-fi. Dennis Johnson's one of my favorite writers. Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, and Carson, like real core kind of people for me. Ursula Gwynn and Ian M. Banks and China Miéville are really like big voices in my head, like sort of in sort of genre spaces. I really, influence is like everything to me. I really crave influence. I think the people who seem the most original are the people who are the widest read. And when someone has one influence, it's always really obvious. When someone has 1,000, they seem like a genius, but they're just like drawing from all the traditions we have of literature. And so I think like the bigger your influence pile is, the better writer you'll be and will be perceived as.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, so definitely some of those speculative realism historical novels I mentioned, so like Colson Whitehead, Mohsen Hamid, Namwali Serpel's book, The Old Drift, made me, when Matt was talking about like books that, you know, have a lot of stuff in them, that's definitely one. Like it starts in like the colonial period from the perspective of like British colonialists in Zambia, and then moves into this like future Zambia with like mosquito drones and stuff. It's really cool. Like it's a book that like it's just, yeah, it's and it feels really fun and like just wild. Like in this, it's also long, I think. So that was a big, even though it's very different from my book, I think that kind of made me feel like, oh, historical novels can be anything, which was very freeing. The Taiwanese writer Wu Ming-yi, who wrote a book called The Man with the Compound Eyes, and it's kind of magical realist. It also has an island in it, but it's a garbage island. It's like based on the Pacific garbage patch that like crashes into the coast of Taiwan. And so it's this kind of allegorical book about like land and like waste. And anyway, it's beautiful. It's translated from Taiwanese. And actually for this book, actually 19th century novels as well. So I love the 19th century. And this book was loosely adapted from Stendhal's The Red and the Black, which is a book about like a young French guy in like provincial France who like is growing up in the wake of Napoleon and idolizes him and wants to become Napoleon. So it's this coming of age novel about like ambition and power, and how he kind of is morally tested as he like moves through the levels of society. So yeah, again, what Matt said, like with blending of genres, right? Like thinking of like sci-fi and like post-colonial fiction, magical realism, but also like very traditional, like 19th century French stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just that idea that as a writer, it's so important to be a reader too, right? And to read widely and to find things that excite you in other books and think of the ways that you can bring that to your own writing, which is so important. Someone has asked about writing prompts, and I wonder if either of you have a place where if you have a go-to writing prompt that you love, or if you have a place where you find prompts, because you both do teach and work with students. How do you interact with writing prompts in your own writing life? And do you got any you want to give folks to take away tonight?
I'll say, not to immediately give you examples for myself, but I do write a Substack that's free at mattbell.substack.com, where I write like monthly craft essays and writing exercises and prompts, and so that may be useful for people. My favorite books of exercise are these two books by Brian Kitely, the 3 a.m. Epiphany and the 4 a.m. Breakthrough, and they're both really great, and they're just like full of like difficult exercises. But sometimes when I'm stuck in a book, I'll just get that off my shelf and I'll try to do the exercises inside the world of the novel I'm writing. And that might be my real exercise advice. Like anything you see in a craft book, you can just try in the manuscript you're writing. Anything you see in someone else's book that you're like, oh, I love the way this is built. Could I do something like that? I know there's a conversation in my second novel that was based on a conversation structure in Don DeLillo's The Names, where I was just like, what a cool way to like break up a conversation. Can I do something similar? And I just always think like, if it still looks like DeLillo a year later, then I have to take it out. But like eventually it'll just like become my own, through revision. I'll forget how DeLillo works and it will start going to be my own thing. So a lot of my self-assigned exercises are like, do that move you saw in somebody else. A lot of what I read in the Substack is really the same thinking. It's like, what was I thinking about in craft this week or this month? And I try to systemize it a little bit. So you can invent your own craft exercises just out of like moves you love in other books. And I think that's worth doing. Yeah,
I'll give a plug to a couple program directors ago, Michael Knoll, who wrote a book called the Writer's Guide to Fiction. I'm going to say I'm
so
probably
good.
butchering
It's
that,
so good.
But it's the idea is that reading to write stories. So taking excerpts from books, analyzing what is being done, what the elements of that piece are, and then giving you a prompt to write your own piece based on that. Yeah, it's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. Rachel, you got any? Where do you come down on writing prompts?
I do not use prompts. I assign them to my students. I don't use them. But I do I think my version of like an exercise is when I read a story that I really love, I break it down. Like I actually do a little like analysis of it. I have this like running Word document where I just write down like the moves and like the turns or like the beat, because I really struggle with momentum and plot, I think, or just like not really plot, but just like, yeah, shape, like making stuff happen, making it feel like energetic. And so I'm really interested in like how stories move. And the last time I did this was with Alice Munro's Hateship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage. I think like 5 of the stories just like blew my mind. And I was like, okay, how did she do it? And I just sat down and I mapped them all out like in bullet point form, like what actually happens and like the way it moves between like scene and memory. And I don't know, just like, and like the way she brings stuff back, like the repetition and like how she evolves like each element. So I do that. And then I try to write a story based on that structure. So I think I kind of, it's a very specific prompt because the thing I struggle with is structure and shape. So I like look at the shapes of things and then I try to replicate them, but like with different characters. So almost like adaptations, I think. And a lot of my stuff is like an adaptation in some way of something else. One of the classes I took in grad school, actually, because I also did my secondary genre in playwriting, was a class that was on adaptation of Greek tragedy. And I think that's something that gets talked about a lot more in like theater than fiction, right? Because in fiction, we don't talk about adaptation that much, but in theater, like everything is some adaptation of something else. There's a lot of like referentiality, same in poetry. And like Shakespeare adapted all his stories, right? They were stories from elsewhere and he just rewrote them. And in many ways, like in fiction, we're also like retelling the same stories again and again because we are borrowing from all these places. So like making that explicit and being like conscious about like, okay, what are you choosing to adapt or change? So that's the exercise like I use the most. For my students, whenever they're stuck, I ask them to write, I ask them to do a free writing piece about a character who either really hates something or really loves something. And if the thing has to be, if it's a love or hate that the writer themselves shares, then they have to give the character a quality that they absolutely do not share, and vice versa. Does that make sense? So if like they're writing like, oh, I had a student write this recently in like a class last week actually, and he did a character who like was who really loved nicotine gum. And the character, the trait that he totally doesn't use nicotine gum in any way. But the trait that the character had, that my student had, was that this character would feel really sad whenever he found out some famous person had died who was a creative person, and he looked up their art and he really loved that art, but it doesn't exist anymore. And now that person's dead, so he'll never be able to like David Bowie or whatever. That was like something that he felt very strongly. So he put that in this like character who's really into it, and it became a really like surprising dynamic character. And so I think that combination of like, trying to get out of writing from your own point of view, but also still taking something personal, so then it like, kind of animates that character, can be helpful.
Oh, I love that. I think you might have a craft book in you one day, Rachel.
Oh my God.
Maybe, especially that exercise, that breaking down the stories. I could see you doing that, and then having a nice explanation and a writing prompt. I'm just saying, if you want to get into the craft book writing biz that Matt Bell is in, we would be remiss if we didn't mention, of course, your wonderful craft book, Matt, which folks can also find on our Book People page. And Refuse to Be Done. It's a really great book, and I've heard from so many friends recently, it's been circulating in the air that folks are turning back to that book. They've already read it, but they're going back to get some more in second shot. So
even better than being read is being reread. Really, someone read your book twice. That's a real gift. Yeah.
I also credit that character point. Sorry, it's from a Margot Livesey exercise about character. Yeah, I think it's like The Hidden Machinery. That's her craft book, and she has this wonderful essay on character, and she talks about like how she creates characters. And I made that exercise from that.
You are so good to give credit where credit is due. I want to thank you both so much for being here tonight, for sharing just your awesome perspectives with us, and for all of the great tips, I think, and just like cool conversation here with you. I feel really honored to have spent this time talking to you. And also, I can't say it enough, your books are beautiful and wonderful, and I hope everybody out there checks them out if you haven't already. And to everyone who's here, thank you for showing up. To our folks on the YouTube live stream, thank you for being here. And I hope everyone has a really great night. Matt and Rachel, you're the best.
You're the best. Thank you so much, Becca.
Thank
It's such
you
a
so
pleasure as
much.
always. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you for having us. Nice to see you.
All right, take care. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for being here.